Desert wind howled through the canyon like the devil's own breath, carrying dust across the Thornwood Ranch, where a master's arrogance would become his eternal prison. The sun beat down mercilessly on New Mexico territory, bleaching bones and secrets alike under its unforgiving glare. This is the story of how a carpenter's hands, calloused from years of forced labor, built not shelter, but a tomb lined with velvet and brass fittings. How skilled fingers that had crafted cradles and church pews turned their art toward darker purpose, measuring dimensions not for the dead, but for the dying. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but in the scorching heat of August 1852, justice came wrapped in pine and sealed with nails driven by hands that would never tremble. What you're about to hear has been buried in territorial records for over a century, hidden beneath layers of dust and deliberate forgetting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. August in the New Mexico territory didn't forgive weakness. The sun hammered down on Thornwood Ranch like a blacksmith working red-hot iron, turning the earth to powder and men's throats to leather. Heat shimmered across 30,000 acres of scrubland where cattle grazed among juniper and pinyon pine, their shadows stretching long across land that had seen blood spilled since before white men claimed ownership with paper and guns. The ranch house rose from the desert floor like a monument to conquest, 2 stories of adobe and timber that Garrett Thornwood had built with money earned from silver mines and human suffering. 15 people lived in bondage on this property, working from dawn until darkness swallowed the horizon, tending livestock, maintaining buildings, serving meals to a man who viewed them as equipment rather than souls. In the carpentry shop behind the main house, 42-year-old Isaiah worked alone, his hands moving across pine boards with the precision of 3 decades. Practice. Sawdust hung thick in the afternoon air, catching sunlight that slanted through gaps in the wooden walls. The shop smelled of fresh-cut timber, linseed oil, and the sweat of labor performed under conditions that would break lesser men. Isaiah had learned his trade from his father, who'd learned from his father before him, skills passed down through generations of enslaved craftsmen whose work enriched masters, while they themselves owned nothing, not even the tools they wielded daily. His hands bore scars from saw blades and hammer strikes, testimonies to years of building furniture, wagons, and coffins, for people who would never thank him directly. The ranch stretched across what had been Mexican territory just 4 years earlier, claimed by the United States through war and treaty, then parceled out to men like Garrett Thornwood who saw opportunity in conquered land. The nearest town, Copper Ridge, sat 12 miles east, a collection of saloons, supply stores, and a sheriff's office that enforced laws protecting property rights above human dignity. Thornwood himself strode through his domain with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his right to own other human beings. At 56, he'd accumulated wealth through silver speculation and careful investment in livestock operations that fed miners working claims throughout the territory. His wife had died 5 years earlier from consumption, leaving him alone in a house too large for one person, attended by servants he treated with casual cruelty. That morning's incident had started over a cabinet door. Isaiah had spent 2 weeks crafting an elaborate china cabinet for the dining room, dovetail joints fitted so precisely that no gaps showed between boards, the finish hand-rubbed until wood glowed like amber in lamplight, but one door hung a fraction of an inch crooked, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Thornwood had noticed immediately. The punishment came swift and public, designed to humiliate as much as hurt. 10 lashes with a leather strap in the courtyard while other workers watched, forced to witness what happened when perfection fell short by the smallest margin. Isaiah had stood silent during the beating, his face revealing nothing while his back screamed, but something inside him crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. 28 years of servitude compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. He would die on this ranch unless he chose differently. Unless he acted instead of endured. The territorial sun climbed toward zenith as Isaiah returned to his workshop, moving carefully to avoid aggravating the welts across his shoulders. Blood had seeped through his shirt, staining fabric already stiff with old sweat and sawdust. Pain transformed into something sharper as he resumed work on the project that would define both their futures. From the Journal of Dr. Benjamin Ashford, August 12, 1852, treated the carpenter Isaiah for lacerations across his back and shoulders. Mr. Thornwood insisted that discipline was necessary for maintaining standards. The wounds will heal, but I wonder what scars form beneath skin where physicians cannot reach. The carpentry shop held everything a craftsman needed. Saws hung on wall pegs, their teeth sharp enough to slice through bone. Chisels rested in felt-lined drawers, edges honed to razor precision. Planes, mallets, measuring tools, and squares occupied their designated spaces in an organization that reflected decades of practiced efficiency. And in the corner, half-finished, stood the current project that Thornwood had commissioned 3 weeks earlier: a coffin. Not for himself, Thornwood had explained with the casual certainty of a man who assumed immortality. For his sister in Santa Fe, who'd taken ill with fever and wasn't expected to survive the month. He wanted something elegant but practical, suitable for transport across difficult terrain, lined with fabric but built sturdy enough to withstand the journey. Isaiah had accepted the commission with appropriate deference, measurements taken, materials selected, work begun with the same meticulous attention he brought to every project. But as his hands shaped wood and fitted joints, another plan took form in his mind with the same careful precision. The coffin would indeed be suitable for transport, would indeed be sturdy enough for a difficult journey. But the occupant would be very different from what Thornwood imagined. Evening brought slight relief from the heat as temperatures dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive. Isaiah worked late in his shop, oil lamps casting shadows that danced across half-finished projects and tools that had built everything on this ranch except freedom. His fingers traced the coffin's interior dimensions, calculating space requirements with practiced expertise. 6 feet long, 24 inches wide, 18 inches deep, standard measurements for a woman of average height. But those same dimensions would accommodate a man if positioned correctly, if breathing holes were drilled in strategic locations, if certain modifications were made that wouldn't be visible during casual inspection. Outside, the desert came alive with nocturnal sounds. Coyotes called across the darkness, their voices rising and falling like prayers to indifferent stars. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly, settling for the night, under watch of ranch hands who earned wages for work that Isaiah performed for nothing beyond survival. He'd been planning this moment for months, gathering information, studying schedules, noting patterns in Thornwood's behavior that revealed vulnerabilities beneath arrogance. The Coffin Commission had arrived, like divine providence, offering opportunity wrapped in tragic circumstance. Tomorrow, Thornwood would inspect the nearly completed work, would examine joints and finish, test the lid's fit, ensure quality met his exacting standards. And tomorrow, Isaiah would be ready with tools positioned precisely, with explanations prepared, with every detail rehearsed, until performance became indistinguishable from reality. The desert night pressed against the workshop walls, hot wind whistling through gaps in the wood. Isaiah's hands moved across the coffin's surface one final time, feeling the smoothness of sanded pine, the precision of fitted corners, the weight of purpose transformed into action. How long could a man survive, sealed inside such a space? How many hours before air grew stale, before panic replaced arrogance, before screams echoed against wood that would never yield to fists or desperation? These calculations occupied Isaiah's thoughts as he extinguished the lamps and walked through darkness toward the quarters where enslaved workers slept, dreaming dreams that rarely survived contact with morning. But tomorrow would bring changes that none of them could predict, built from rage and carpentry skills, sealed with nails and the mathematics of suffocation. Garrett Thornwood's empire began with luck disguised as vision. He'd arrived in New Mexico Territory in 1847, following rumors of silver deposits that made men rich overnight or killed them trying. Unlike the desperate prospectors who gambled everything on uncertain claims, Thornwood invested in the infrastructure of mining itself, supplying equipment, food, and labor to operations that turned mountains inside out searching for precious metal. His wealth accumulated through calculated risk rather than reckless speculation. While others chased glory in dark tunnels, Thornwood built supply chains, negotiated contracts, and acquired property at prices reflecting Mexican land grants of questionable legal standing. The war with Mexico had redrawn borders, creating opportunities for men willing to exploit chaos. The ranch came third in his portfolio, purchased from a Spanish family whose claim predated American occupation but couldn't survive the new legal framework that favored English-speaking landowners with connections to territorial government. 30,000 acres of scrubland that seemed worthless until you understood how cattle could thrive on desert vegetation, how water rights made kingdoms in arid country, how proximity to mining camps created guaranteed markets for beef. Thornwood had married Elena Vasquez in 1843, a union that combined his ambition with her family's fading respectability. She'd brought grace to his rough existence, softening edges that wealth alone couldn't polish. Her death in 1847 from consumption had left him bitter, convinced that the universe owed him compensation for loss. That bitterness manifested as cruelty toward those who couldn't resist. The 15 enslaved people he owned had been acquired through various transactions, purchased from estates, traded for goods, inherited through his wife's dowry. He viewed them as investments requiring maintenance and discipline, assets that depreciated without proper management. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At the ranch house's dining table, Thornwood ate meals prepared by hands he'd never thanked, served on china transported from St. Louis at considerable expense. The food reflected skills passed down through generations, recipes combining Mexican traditions with techniques learned from southern plantation kitchens. But taste meant less to him than the demonstration of ownership, the ability to command and be obeyed. Isaiah occupied a unique position in this hierarchy. Skilled craftsmen possessed value beyond simple labor, their expertise difficult to replace in territory where trained workers remained scarce. Thornwood needed Isaiah's carpentry skills for maintaining buildings, constructing furniture, creating the physical infrastructure that made ranch life possible in harsh environment. This dependency created a strange dynamic where Isaiah experienced slightly better treatment than field workers, his value protecting him from the worst excesses of Thornwood's temper. But better remained relative in a system built on absolute power imbalance, and this morning's beating demonstrated how quickly protection evaporated when perfection fell short. Isaiah had arrived at Thornwood Ranch 8 years earlier, sold by a Texas rancher, settling debts after drought destroyed his cattle operation. The journey from Texas to New Mexico had taken 3 weeks, shackled in a wagon with 6 others, traveling through country where Apache raiders made every mile dangerous for all parties regardless of their legal status. He'd left behind a wife and daughter, sold separately to different buyers, scattered like seeds that would never take root together. That separation had carved hollow spaces inside him that 28 years of forced labor hadn't filled, creating voids where love once lived, replacing warmth with cold calculation about survival and revenge. The carpentry shop became his refuge, the one place where Thornwood's oversight relaxed slightly, trusting that skilled work required concentration incompatible with constant supervision. Here, surrounded by tools and timber, Isaiah could think without interruption, planning futures that extended beyond tomorrow's labor. He'd studied the ranch's layout obsessively, noting distances between buildings, understanding sight lines that revealed or concealed activities, learning which hours brought visitors and which passed in isolated routine. Information gathered patiently over years, stored carefully against the day when knowledge might transform into action. Other workers on the ranch existed in their own hells, each unique in details but united in fundamental powerlessness. Maria worked the main house kitchen, her cooking skills making her valuable but not safe from Thornwood's anger when meals displeased him. Thomas tended livestock, spending days alone on horseback checking fence lines and water sources across terrain that could kill the unprepared. Sarah maintained the household, cleaning rooms and washing clothes with efficiency born from understanding that mistakes brought punishment. Her husband Jacob worked as a blacksmith shoeing horses and repairing equipment in a forge that turned small spaces into furnaces during summer months. They all knew about Isaiah's beating. Word spread through the community of enslaved workers with the speed of wind across open desert, carrying warnings about Thornwood's mood, sharing information that helped others avoid similar fates. But this beating felt different somehow, carrying an edge that suggested something had shifted in the carpenter's demeanor. Sarah had noticed it first, mentioning to Maria that Isaiah's eyes looked strange after returning from punishment, empty in a way that suggested he'd stopped seeing the present and started focusing on something beyond their immediate circumstances. Maria had nodded understanding, recognizing the expression from her own mirror on days when endurance seemed harder than dying. From the correspondence of Garrett Thornwood, August 10, 1852. My dear sister Catherine, I write with heavy heart regarding your illness. Dr. Morrison's latest letter suggests your condition worsens despite treatment. I have commissioned a suitable coffin from my carpenter, built to your specifications with quality befitting our family name. Should the worst occur, you will make the journey home with dignity preserved. The coffin project had consumed Isaiah's attention for 3 weeks, each joint fitted with precision that exceeded even his normal standards. Thornwood inspected progress regularly, running fingers along seams, testing lid closure, ensuring quality matched his expectations. The work satisfied him, rare praise emerging from lips more accustomed to criticism. But Isaiah built with purposes Thornwood couldn't imagine. Each measurement contained hidden calculations, each feature served dual functions. The interior fabric would mask certain modifications. The lid's design allowed for specific manipulations. Small details that seemed decorative actually served darker intentions. He'd been gathering supplies slowly, items small enough to escape notice when taken individually, a length of rope acquired from the tack room, chloroform purchased in Copper Ridge, under pretense of needing it for wood finishing, metal fittings that could serve as restraints if positioned correctly, pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't reveal its picture until assembly reached completion. The desert night settled around the ranch like a blanket woven from darkness and heat. In his quarters, Isaiah lay awake on a thin mattress, his back throbbing from that morning's beating, his mind racing through tomorrow's planned sequence of events. Each step had been rehearsed mentally hundreds of times, refined until the plan achieved the same precision as his carpentry work. Thornwood slept in the main house, comfortable in his bed, secure in his power, confident that tomorrow would resemble yesterday in all the ways that mattered to a man who'd never questioned his right to own human beings. His dreams, whatever they contained, didn't include the possibility that his carpenter had been building more than furniture in that workshop. How many masters sleep soundly above foundations built by hands that plot their destruction? How many empires rest on skills possessed by people treated as possessions rather than persons? The mathematics of oppression never account for the moment when the oppressed stop calculating survival and start planning revolution. That moment for Isaiah would arrive with tomorrow's sunrise, carried on desert wind that cared nothing for justice or mercy, witnessed only by stars too distant to intervene in human affairs playing out beneath their indifferent light. The morning of August 13th dawned with the false promise of clouds that would burn away before noon, leaving only memory of relief that never arrived. Isaiah rose before sunrise, moving carefully as healing welts pulled tight across his shoulders, each motion a reminder of yesterday's humiliation performed for an audience of people who shared his powerlessness. He walked through pre-dawn darkness toward the carpentry shop, carrying a lunch pail that Maria had prepared filled with cornbread and salted pork that would sustain him through the long day ahead. Other workers were beginning to stir in their quarters, preparing for another cycle of labor that would end only when darkness made continued work impossible. The shop felt different this morning, charged with potential energy like the moment before lightning strikes. Isaiah lit oil lamps with steady hands, their glow revealing the nearly completed coffin that dominated the workspace. 3 weeks of meticulous construction had produced a piece worthy of Thornwood's sister, elegant in its simplicity, sturdy enough for the difficult journey to Santa Fe. But today would bring the final inspection, the moment when Thornwood would examine every detail before authorizing completion. Isaiah had prepared for this meeting with the same care he brought to the woodwork itself, anticipating questions, rehearsing responses, positioning tools where they could be reached quickly if opportunity presented itself. The sun climbed above the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold that would darken to brass as heat intensified. Isaiah worked on finishing touches, rubbing linseed oil into wood grain until it glowed with warm depth, polishing brass fittings until they caught lamplight like captured stars. Every detail mattered, because Thornwood noticed everything, his attention to quality matching his attention to maintaining absolute control over his domain. Footsteps approached across the courtyard at mid-morning, boots crunching against gravel in rhythm that Isaiah recognized without looking. Garrett Thornwood entered the workshop with the proprietary air of a man inspecting property he owned, which included not just the building and its contents but the person working within. He wore clothing suited to ranch management, practical rather than fashionable, but cut from fabric that announced wealth. Dust already clung to his boots despite the early hour, testimony to rounds checking cattle operations and irrigation systems that kept the ranch functioning in hostile environment. "Show me," Thornwood commanded without greeting, gesturing toward the coffin. Isaiah stepped back with appropriate deference, allowing his master unobstructed view of the completed work. Thornwood circled the piece slowly, fingers trailing along edges, testing joints, examining the fabric-lined interior with critical eye that had made him successful in business dealings that required detecting flaws others missed. "The lid," Thornwood said, and Isaiah lifted it smoothly, demonstrating how perfectly it fit, how the seal would protect contents during transport across rough terrain. The brass hinges moved without sound, recently oiled, designed to last decades beyond their likely use. Thornwood leaned closer, inspecting the interior lining, running his hand across purple velvet that Isaiah had fitted with precision that left no wrinkles or gaps. The fabric would cushion his sister's body during her final journey, providing dignity even in death, assuming she actually died as expected. "Adequate work," Thornwood said finally, which from him represented high praise. "Though I expect nothing less given the beating required to maintain your focus." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, deliberately cruel, designed to remind Isaiah of his place in the hierarchy that governed their every interaction. This casual reference to yesterday's humiliation, delivered without remorse or recognition of its brutality, triggered something that had been building for 28 years. Isaiah felt it happen inside him, a shift so fundamental that the world suddenly looked different, as if he'd been viewing reality through distorted glass that suddenly cleared. Fear that had governed his decisions for decades evaporated, replaced by clarity cold and sharp as the chisels hanging on his workshop wall. "Sir," Isaiah said carefully, his voice carrying none of the rage crystallizing in his chest, "there's one detail I'd like your opinion on before I consider it truly finished." Thornwood raised an eyebrow, surprised that his carpenter would offer input beyond what had been requested. "What detail?" "The interior depth," Isaiah explained, gesturing toward the coffin. "I measured according to your sister's height as you provided, but I'm concerned the fit might be too tight. Would you mind lying inside briefly so I can verify there's adequate space? Your build is similar enough to serve as proper test." The request seemed reasonable on its surface, practical even, the kind of attention to detail that Thornwood valued in craftsmen who served him. But something in Isaiah's tone made him hesitate, instinct warning of dangers that logic couldn't identify. "That seems unnecessary," Thornwood said slowly. "Of course, sir," Isaiah replied with perfect deference. "I simply want to ensure quality meets your standards. After yesterday's discipline regarding the cabinet door, I'm especially motivated to avoid any imperfection that might require correction." The reference to the beating served dual purpose, reminding Thornwood of his power while also suggesting that Isaiah had internalized the lesson, that fear rather than defiance motivated his excessive caution. This interpretation aligned with Thornwood's worldview, where punishment produced compliance, where pain taught lessons that words alone couldn't convey. Thornwood studied the coffin again, pride in his own judgment, warring with vague unease that he couldn't articulate. The piece truly was exceptional work, worthy of family use, demonstrating skills that made Isaiah valuable property. Testing the interior space seemed reasonable, even prudent, ensuring his sister's body would rest comfortably during transport. "Very well," Thornwood decided, his vanity conquering caution, "a quick test to satisfy your concerns." He approached the coffin, looking down into its velvet-lined interior, seeing craftsmanship rather than trap, appreciating quality instead of recognizing danger. Isaiah positioned a wooden step stool beside the piece, offering stability as Thornwood prepared to climb inside. "Just lie back naturally," Isaiah instructed, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I'll check the head clearance and side spacing." Thornwood lowered himself into the coffin with awkward dignity, settling against the purple velvet lining, his head resting where his sister's was meant to lie. The space accommodated him comfortably, neither too tight nor unnecessarily spacious, demonstrating Isaiah's skill at measuring and construction. "Seems fine," Thornwood said, starting to rise. But Isaiah's hand moved to the cloth, soaked in chloroform, that he'd positioned within reach, hidden beneath wood shavings on the workbench. The motion was practiced, rehearsed mentally 1,000 times, executed with the same precision he brought to dovetail joints and mortise cuts. The cloth pressed against Thornwood's face before he could react, chemical smell filling his nostrils as he inhaled involuntarily. His eyes widened in sudden understanding, hands coming up to fight. But Isaiah held firm with strength, built from 3 decades of physical labor, maintaining pressure until Thornwood's struggles weakened, then ceased entirely. Silence filled the workshop, except for Isaiah's heavy breathing and the unconscious man's shallow respiration. The moment had arrived, the point of no return crossed, the future now dependent on actions rather than endurance. Outside, the New Mexico sun climbed toward noon, indifferent to human dramas playing out beneath its burning gaze. Inside the carpentry shop, a carpenter stood over his master, holding tools that would build not shelter but tomb, measuring dimensions not for the dead but for the dying. What happened next would either be murder or justice, depending on who survived to tell the story. The unconscious man in the coffin represented both opportunity and death sentence. Isaiah stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, chloroform-soaked cloth still gripped in his hand, watching Thornwood's chest rise and fall with the shallow breathing of chemically induced sleep. The workshop around him suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward as the magnitude of his actions crystallized into undeniable reality. There would be no forgiveness for this, no explanation that would satisfy territorial law or the social order it protected. He'd crossed a boundary that separated the oppressed who endured from those who struck back. Entering territory where survival meant completing what he'd started or dying in the attempt. But this moment hadn't arrived spontaneously. The planning had consumed months of careful thought, stolen moments when he could think without observation, nights when sleep proved impossible beneath the weight of accumulated rage. Every detail had been considered, every contingency examined, every possible outcome mapped against the landscape of probable consequences. The chloroform purchased 3 weeks earlier from the apothecary in Copper Ridge, justified as solvent for removing old varnish from furniture pieces. The rope acquired gradually, short lengths taken from the tack room where inventory was loose enough that small disappearances went unnoticed. The modified hinges on the coffin lid, designed to lock from outside in ways that wouldn't be visible during casual inspection. Isaiah had studied Thornwood's schedule with the attention that survival demanded, learning patterns that governed the master's movements across his domain. Morning inspections of livestock operations, afternoon correspondence in his study, evening meals taken alone in the dining room. Predictable routines created windows of opportunity for those patient enough to recognize them. Today's inspection had been inevitable. Thornwood always examined commissioned work before final approval, his perfectionism ensuring quality but also creating vulnerability. The coffin project offered unique circumstances that might never repeat, a legitimate reason for the master to position himself exactly where Isaiah needed him. Moving quickly now, Isaiah retrieved the rope he'd hidden beneath his workbench, his hands working with the practiced efficiency of a craftsman who understood his materials. Thornwood's wrists came together, bound tightly enough to prevent escape, but carefully positioned to avoid cutting off circulation entirely. Death would come, but slowly, with time for reflection on the cruelty that had earned this fate. The ankles next, secured with knots that wouldn't slip regardless of desperate struggling. Isaiah had learned rope work from his father, skills meant for securing loads on wagons and tying livestock, now adapted to restrain a man who'd never imagined his carpenter possessed both the knowledge and courage for such application. A strip of cloth torn from burlap sacking served as gag, stuffed into Thornwood's mouth and tied behind his head with precision that prevented choking while ensuring silence. The unconscious man's breathing continued steady, the chloroform keeping him under for perhaps another 10 minutes based on the amount Isaiah had administered. Time compressed and expanded simultaneously, minutes feeling like hours while Isaiah worked, yet the entire binding process took less than 5 minutes by the workshop clock. Efficiency born from mental rehearsal, every motion practiced in imagination until execution became mechanical. The coffin lid closed with a whisper of well-fitted wood, brass hinges moving smoothly on recently oiled pins. Isaiah examined the exterior one final time, ensuring nothing visible suggested anything unusual about the piece. To any observer, it appeared exactly as commissioned, a quality coffin ready for transport to Santa Fe. But the interior held modifications invisible from outside. Small holes drilled through the base at strategic locations, concealed by the velvet lining, would provide minimal airflow while the lid remained closed. Not enough for comfort, but sufficient to prevent immediate suffocation. Isaiah had calculated carefully, measuring air volume against human consumption rates, determining how long Thornwood could survive sealed inside. The mathematics of murder proved surprisingly straightforward. An adult male at rest consumed roughly 15 liters of oxygen per hour. The coffin's interior volume, accounting for the body itself, provided perhaps 200 liters of available air. Minus the oxygen already bound in carbon dioxide and nitrogen, the usable portion dropped to 40 liters. 2.5 hours, maybe 3 if panic didn't accelerate breathing. Long enough for Thornwood to wake from chloroform-induced unconsciousness. Long enough to understand his situation completely. Long enough to experience the terror of suffocation while sealed in darkness with no possibility of rescue. But Isaiah wouldn't seal the lid immediately. The plan required more elaborate staging, creating circumstances that would explain Thornwood's disappearance in ways that deflected suspicion away from murder. The ranch operated with enough daily chaos that a missing master might be attributed to accident, misadventure, even voluntary departure under mysterious circumstances. From the workshop, Isaiah could see across the courtyard toward the main house where Maria would be preparing the midday meal, unaware that everything was about to change. Other workers moved through their routines, visible through gaps in the wooden walls, tending livestock, maintaining equipment, performing the endless labor that kept the ranch functioning. None of them could know what had happened in this shop. Their survival depended on genuine ignorance when questions inevitably came, when authorities investigated, when the system that enslaved them sought someone to punish for the master's disappearance. Isaiah would protect them through their lack of knowledge, ensuring that whatever consequences followed would fall on him alone. Before we continue deeper into how Isaiah executed his desperate plan, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear has been buried in territorial records for over a century. The ranch bell rang for midday meal, its sound carrying across the property to summon workers for their brief respite from labor. Isaiah emerged from his workshop with calculated normalcy, walking toward the communal dining area where enslaved workers gathered for food distributed by Maria and her kitchen assistants. His back still ached from yesterday's beating, welts pulling tight beneath his shirt with each movement. But pain had transformed into fuel, driving him forward through actions that would either liberate or destroy him. There would be no middle ground, no partial victory or negotiated settlement, only absolute success or complete failure, with consequences measured in continued servitude or summary execution. "You look troubled," Sarah observed quietly as Isaiah accepted his plate of beans and cornbread. Her eyes searched his face with the perception that came from years of reading subtle signals that meant survival in hostile environment. "Back hurts," Isaiah replied simply, which carried enough truth to satisfy without revealing deeper currents flowing beneath surface calm. Thornwood inspected the coffin this morning, seemed pleased with the work. The casual mention of his master served dual purpose, establishing alibi while redirecting attention toward normal interactions. If anyone later questioned the morning's events, Sarah would remember this conversation, confirming that Isaiah had spoken of Thornwood in present tense, suggesting nothing unusual had occurred. The meal passed in relative silence, workers too exhausted for extensive conversation, focused on consuming calories that would fuel afternoon labor under sun that showed no mercy regardless of human suffering. Isaiah ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind racing through the steps that would follow once he returned to the workshop. Thornwood would wake soon, perhaps already stirring from chloroform-induced unconsciousness, beginning to understand the situation he faced. The terror would start gradually, confusion giving way to recognition, recognition transforming into panic, as he tested his bonds and found them unyielding. Screams would come next, muffled by the gag and contained by the coffin's sturdy construction. But no one would hear. The workshop sat far enough from other buildings that sounds didn't carry, especially during midday when work noises created their own masking effect. Isaiah had chosen his location carefully, understanding how distance and distraction would protect his secret long enough to complete what he'd started. The afternoon stretched ahead like a road with no visible destination, hours that would determine whether 3 decades of servitude ended in liberation or simply shifted from one form of bondage to another. Because killing Thornwood solved nothing if Isaiah couldn't escape the territory before discovery, couldn't reach free states where his testimony about self-defense might carry weight against charges of murder. He'd been planning that escape with the same meticulous attention he brought to carpentry work. Maps committed to memory showing routes north toward Colorado Territory, then east toward Kansas, where abolition sentiment ran strong enough that fugitive slaves sometimes found protection. Money saved over years from occasional odd jobs in Copper Ridge, coins hidden in a leather pouch that would fund his journey if he could reach it, before manhunt made travel impossible. The plan required timing-precise as joinery, each element fitting together in sequence that couldn't be disrupted without complete collapse. Thornwood must remain undiscovered long enough for Isaiah to establish head start. The coffin must be transported according to the original commission, creating legitimate reason for its presence on a wagon heading toward Santa Fe. And somewhere along that route, the sealed cargo would be abandoned in a location remote enough that discovery might take days or weeks. By then, Isaiah would be far from New Mexico territory, traveling through country where his face didn't match wanted posters, where his skills as carpenter might earn legitimate wages in communities that asked few questions about a man's past. Freedom existed somewhere beyond the horizon if he possessed courage to chase it and luck sufficient to survive the pursuit that would inevitably follow. But first he had to return to the workshop where his master lay bound and waking, beginning to understand that the natural order he'd assumed permanent had shattered, like glass struck by hammer. Where power built on cruelty discovered its foundation less stable than the man who'd wielded it ever imagined. The midday meal ended, workers dispersing back to their assigned tasks, the ranch resuming its rhythm as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed in ways they couldn't yet perceive, shifts occurring beneath the surface of apparent normalcy, cracks spreading through structures that had seemed eternal. Isaiah walked back across the courtyard toward his workshop, each step carrying him further from the life he'd known and closer to an unknown future that promised either liberation or death. Behind him, the main house stood empty now, its master absent for the first time in 8 years, a silence spreading through rooms that had witnessed countless cruelties delivered with casual indifference. The desert sun reached its zenith, bleaching colors from the landscape, casting shadows so short they disappeared entirely. In that moment of perfect overhead light, where nothing could hide in darkness because darkness had been burned away, Isaiah opened the workshop door and stepped inside to face what he'd created. The coffin sat exactly where he'd left it, appearing innocent to any observer who might glance through the door. But Isaiah could hear sounds from within now, muffled thumps and scrapes as Thornwood tested his prison, discovering that the carpenter's work was far too good to fail under pressure from inside. Perfect craftsmanship had sealed a tomb that would hold its occupant until Isaiah decided otherwise, until justice measured in hours of suffocating darkness balanced against decades of systematic cruelty. The sounds from inside the coffin had evolved from confused, struggling to methodical attempts at escape by the time Isaiah secured the workshop door behind him. Thornwood had fully awakened, his intelligence cutting through chloroform fog to assess his situation with the same analytical precision he applied to business negotiations. But intelligence without leverage meant nothing when surrounded by walls built by expert hands. Isaiah stood motionless for a long moment, listening to the trapped man's efforts, hearing panic beginning to overcome reason as Thornwood understood the thoroughness of his imprisonment. The thumping grew more desperate, accompanied by muffled sounds that might have been pleas or threats, impossible to distinguish through gag and wood. "I can hear you," Isaiah said quietly, his voice carrying across the workshop with a calmness that felt alien to his own ears. "And you can hear me, which means you understand that I'm in control now, that your life depends on decisions I make, just as mine has depended on your decisions for 8 years." The sounds from the coffin ceased abruptly. Thornwood was listening now, calculating odds, searching for angles that might be exploited even from inside a sealed box. The master's mind remained sharp despite circumstances, still believing that intelligence and negotiation could overcome any obstacle. Isaiah approached the coffin slowly, his boots striking the wooden floor with deliberate rhythm. "Yesterday you had me beaten for a cabinet door that hung slightly crooked. 10 lashes with a leather strap in front of everyone, designed to humiliate as much as hurt. Do you remember that?" Silence from within, though Isaiah could imagine Thornwood's expression, the realization dawning that this wasn't spontaneous violence but carefully planned revenge. that the carpenter he'd underestimated possessed both patience and capacity for strategic thinking. "I've been planning this for months," Isaiah continued, circling the coffin as Thornwood had circled it during this morning's inspection. "Gathering materials, studying your routines, waiting for the right opportunity. This coffin you commissioned for your sister became the perfect vehicle for your own imprisonment." He placed his hand on the lid, feeling vibrations as Thornwood resumed struggling beneath the wood. "The air inside is limited. You have perhaps 2 hours before suffocation becomes inevitable. But I'm not going to let you die quickly. That would be too merciful given what you've done to me, to my family, to everyone who has suffered under your ownership." The plan Isaiah had developed involved more than simple murder sealed in wood and darkness. He needed Thornwood's disappearance to appear consistent with accident or voluntary departure, creating confusion that would delay investigation long enough for escape to become possible. The coffin would play its role, but not here in the workshop where discovery seemed inevitable. Moving to his workbench, Isaiah gathered tools and materials he'd prepared over previous weeks: a hand truck capable of moving heavy loads, rope for securing cargo, a canvas tarp that would conceal the coffin during transport. Each item served purposes both practical and symbolic, transforming instruments of honest labor into implements of calculated vengeance. "You're going on a journey," Isaiah explained as he worked, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency that had made him valuable to the man now trapped by that same expertise. "The coffin will be loaded onto a wagon as planned, supposedly bound for Santa Fe to await your sister's death, but the destination will be very different." He positioned the hand truck beside the coffin, calculating angles and leverage points needed to move several hundred pounds of wood and human cargo. The physics involved were straightforward for someone who'd spent decades moving heavy materials, understanding how proper technique could accomplish what brute strength alone never could. 12 miles east of here there's an abandoned mine shaft," Isaiah continued, partly for Thornwood's benefit but mostly organizing his own thoughts, rehearsing the sequence of actions that would follow. "Collapsed during silver speculation 5 years ago, killed 3 miners, never been properly filled, deep enough that anything dropped inside disappears completely." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Thornwood would understand now that his carpenter had planned not just imprisonment but permanent disposal, that the coffin built for transport would become a tomb in both figurative and literal senses. Fear would be spreading through him now, cold and paralyzing, the same fear that enslaved people felt daily under threat of violence they couldn't prevent. Isaiah tilted the coffin onto the hand truck with controlled precision, the weight substantial but manageable using leverage and careful balance. Thornwood's body shifted inside, creating new sounds of distress as orientation changed from horizontal to nearly vertical. The bound man couldn't brace himself properly, couldn't prevent the sliding and bumping that came with being cargo rather than person. "8 years ago you separated me from my wife and daughter," Isaiah said as he secured the coffin with rope, his voice finally carrying emotion beneath the surface calm. "Sold by a Texas rancher to pay his debts, loaded into a wagon like livestock, transported across territory where Apache raids killed travelers regularly. I prayed for raiders during that journey, hoping death would come quick instead of this slow suffocation under your ownership." The workshop door opened smoothly, despite the heavy load Isaiah now maneuvered toward it, the hand truck's wheels rolling across wooden floors with quiet efficiency. Outside, the afternoon sun struck like a physical blow, heat radiating from every surface, turning the air thick and hard to breathe even for those not trapped in confined spaces. The courtyard appeared empty, other workers occupied with their assigned tasks in locations distant enough that casual observation wouldn't reveal what the carpenter was transporting. Isaiah had timed this movement to coincide with the afternoon lull, when supervision relaxed slightly, when heat made everyone seek shade rather than patrol grounds looking for violations to punish. A wagon stood near the workshop, prepared that morning for precisely this purpose. Isaiah had requisitioned it under the legitimate explanation that the completed coffin required transport to Copper Ridge for the first leg of its journey to Santa Fe. No one questioned this reasoning, because Thornwood himself had authorized the plan days earlier, creating permission that now facilitated his own disposal. Loading the coffin into the wagon bed required careful maneuvering, but Isaiah had practiced the movements mentally until they became automatic. The sealed box settled into position with a solid thump, secured with additional ropes that would prevent shifting during travel across rough terrain. A canvas tarp draped over the cargo completed the preparation, creating an innocuous-looking load that might contain furniture or supplies rather than a dying man. From Territorial Records, August 13, 1852, wagon reported leaving Thornwood Ranch at approximately 2 p.m., driven by enslaved Carpenter Isaiah, supposedly transporting completed Coffin to Copper Ridge for forwarding to Santa Fe. No witnesses reported anything unusual about the departure. Isaiah climbed onto the wagon seat, reins in hand, his heart hammering, despite the outward calm he maintained for anyone who might be watching. The horses responded to his commands with familiar obedience, pulling the wagon forward across the courtyard, toward the eastern road that led to Copper Ridge and beyond. Behind the canvas tarp, Thornwood would be experiencing true helplessness now. The jolting of wagon wheels over uneven ground transmitted through wood into his bound body. Each bump and sway reminded him that control had transferred completely, that his fate now depended on the mercy of a man he'd never shown mercy toward. The ranch buildings receded behind them as the wagon rolled eastward, dust rising from wheels and hooves to hang in the still afternoon air. Isaiah kept the pace steady but not rushed, maintaining the appearance of a routine errand rather than desperate escape. Other workers, visible in distant fields, didn't look up from their labor, having no reason to suspect that their master was leaving his property for the last time, sealed in darkness, consuming the limited air that separated life from suffocation. The road to Copper Ridge stretched ahead, 12 miles of desert scrubland broken by occasional creek beds and stands of juniper. But Isaiah wouldn't reach the town itself. 6 miles east, a barely visible track branched northward toward abandoned mining claims that had produced more corpses than silver. That track would carry them to the mine shaft that represented Thornwood's final destination. 2 hours of air, Isaiah had calculated. The journey to the mine would consume 90 minutes, leaving a narrow margin between arrival and death by suffocation. Thornwood might already be experiencing the first symptoms, the subtle headache and disorientation that preceded more serious oxygen deprivation. Panic would accelerate the process, fear consuming air faster than calm acceptance ever could. Isaiah had wondered during his planning whether he could actually complete this act, whether the moment would arrive when conscience or fear would make him stop, release his prisoner, accept whatever punishment followed from assault rather than murder. But as the wagon rolled across desert landscape unchanged, since before humans claimed ownership of it, he felt nothing except cold determination and something that might have been peace. 28 years of servitude, of watching family torn apart, of enduring casual cruelty delivered by a man who never questioned his right to inflict suffering on those he considered property rather than people. The mathematics of justice didn't require sophisticated calculation. Thornwood had built this moment through accumulated cruelty, constructed his own tomb through decisions made without thought for consequences. The sun tracked westward as they traveled, shadows beginning to lengthen toward evening, though hours remained before sunset. Desert heat would persist until darkness fell completely, maintaining temperatures that made breathing difficult even with unlimited air. Inside the sealed coffin, conditions would be approaching unbearable, heat and oxygen depletion combining to create suffering that exceeded anything physical beating could inflict. Isaiah wondered if Thornwood was praying. If the man who'd shown no mercy toward others now begged a God he'd ignored during prosperous years to intervene, to inspire compassion in the carpenter who held his life in calloused hands. But the desert absorbed prayers without answer, indifferent to human concerns about justice or mercy or the complex calculations that separated murder from righteous vengeance. The turnoff appeared exactly where Isaiah remembered, a trace barely visible among the scrubland, marked by a cairn of stones that miners had erected to guide late-night returns from claims that ultimately proved worthless. The wagon turned northward, wheels finding the rougher track, bouncing over obstacles that made the sealed coffin shift despite securing ropes. From beneath the canvas came sounds that might have been weakening struggles or simply the settling of cargo during transport. Isaiah didn't investigate. Didn't confirm whether Thornwood remained conscious or had succumbed already to oxygen deprivation. The plan required completion regardless of the prisoner's current state, delivering him to the destination that would ensure permanent concealment. The abandoned mine appeared after 20 minutes of slow progress through increasingly difficult terrain. A wooden framework marked the shaft opening, weathered boards gray with age and sun exposure, warning signs long since blown away by desert wind. The opening itself yawned like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Darkness visible even in afternoon sunlight, descending into earth at an angle that suggested depths beyond normal measuring. Isaiah stopped the wagon 30 feet from the shaft, setting the brake and securing the reins before climbing down. The desert silence pressed against his ears, broken only by horse breathing and the whisper of wind through juniper branches. No other humans visible in any direction, no witnesses to what would happen next. He approached the canvas-covered coffin with steady steps, no hesitation remaining now that the moment had arrived for final action. The tarp pulled away easily, revealing the sealed box that appeared unchanged despite the journey, but appearances deceived. Inside, Thornwood had consumed most of his available air, was likely unconscious or approaching it, brain fog making clear thought impossible as his body struggled with insufficient oxygen. Isaiah didn't open the lid to check, didn't grant his prisoner final words or opportunity for pleas that might weaken resolve built over months of careful planning. Instead, he maneuvered the hand truck into position, tilted the coffin back onto it, and rolled the entire assembly toward the mine shaft opening. The coffin balanced at the shaft's edge for 3 heartbeats, teetering between surface and abyss, caught in that liminal moment where minor force would determine its final destination. Isaiah stood behind it, hands gripping the wooden sides, feeling the weight of both cargo and decision pressing down through his arms into the earth beneath his feet. One push would complete everything, would seal Thornwood's fate permanently in darkness deeper than any grave, where discovery would require luck bordering on divine intervention. The mine shaft descended at least 60 feet based on reports from the collapse that had killed those 3 miners in 1847. Perhaps deeper in sections where original excavation had followed, promising silver veins into the mountain's heart. Isaiah's hands trembled slightly, the first physical manifestation of emotion he'd allowed since this morning's attack in the workshop. Not from fear or regret, but from the enormity of what he was about to do. The absolute irreversibility of an action that would transform him from victim to murderer, in the eyes of any law that might judge his actions. But the law had never protected him, had never questioned Thornwood's right to purchase human beings and use them as he saw fit, working them until their bodies broke, beating them for imperfections measured in fractions of inches, separating families with the same casual indifference a man might show when selling livestock. Why should he respect legal frameworks that treated him as property rather than person? The push came smoothly, inevitably, with the same controlled precision Isaiah brought to every physical task. The coffin tilted past the balance point, gravity claiming it, pulling it forward and down into darkness that swallowed it completely within seconds. The sound of impact came several heartbeats later, a distant crash of wood against stone, followed by smaller noises as debris settled. Then silence returned to the desert, absolute and final. Isaiah stood at the shaft's edge, staring into darkness that revealed nothing, feeling nothing except a strange emptiness where rage had lived for so long that its absence created a void more disturbing than its presence. He'd expected satisfaction or relief or some emotional validation that justice had been served. Instead, he felt only the cold awareness that he'd crossed into territory from which no return was possible. The wagon waited behind him, horses stamping impatiently, unaware that their load had diminished by several hundred pounds. Isaiah turned away from the shaft without further ceremony, no prayers spoken, no final words delivered to a man who could no longer hear them. Thornwood was gone, sealed in darkness that would preserve his remains for decades or centuries, depending on how deeply the coffin had fallen and what geological forces might eventually expose or further conceal it. The return journey toward Copper Ridge resumed, though Isaiah's destination had changed now that the primary objective was complete. He couldn't return to Thornwood Ranch. Couldn't maintain the pretense that nothing unusual had occurred, that the master had simply departed on business and would return in due time. Discovery was inevitable once Thornwood's absence extended beyond a day or two, and suspicion would fall immediately on the carpenter who'd been last to see him alive. Escape became the only logical next step, fleeing territory before Manhunt organization could cut off routes northward toward free states. Isaiah had prepared for this contingency, hiding supplies and documents in locations between the ranch and Colorado border, creating a chain of resources that would sustain him during the dangerous journey ahead. But first, he needed to establish alibi and misdirection that might delay pursuit long enough to gain crucial head start. The wagon rolled into Copper Ridge as afternoon shadows lengthened toward evening, dust from the main street coating everything in fine powder that turned gold in the declining sunlight. The town maintained its usual level of controlled chaos, freight wagons loading supplies for mining camps, cowboys drinking away wages in saloons that never closed, merchants conducting business from storefronts that promised everything from hardware to salvation. Isaiah guided his wagon toward the livery stable where arrangements had been made days earlier for storage of equipment supposedly awaiting transport to Santa Fe. "Coffin's been delivered," Isaiah told the stable owner, a grizzled man named Harlan who asked few questions as long as payment arrived on time. "Mr. Thornwood said I should leave the wagon here until he sends word about the next shipment." Harlan nodded without particular interest, accepting the explanation with the indifference of someone who'd learned that curiosity about other people's business brought more trouble than profit. "Stall 3 is open. Unhitch the team and they can rest in the corral." The transaction completed smoothly, creating the impression that everything had proceeded according to plan, that the carpenter was simply following his master's instructions before returning to the ranch. But Isaiah wouldn't be returning. The moment Harlan turned away to tend other customers, Isaiah slipped out the stable's back entrance, moving through Copper Ridge's alleys with the invisibility that came from being black in a town that rarely noticed enslaved people unless they caused problems. His prepared supplies waited in a storage shed behind the town's only church, hidden among donated goods intended for poor families. Food preserved in sealed containers, a canteen filled with water, extra clothing that would help him blend into populations further north, and most importantly, the forged freedom papers that identified him as Joshua Freeman, a skilled carpenter traveling to Denver seeking employment. The documents had cost him 2 years' worth of carefully saved coins, commissioned from a former slave who'd escaped to Kansas and now made his living creating papers that transformed fugitives into free men on parchment, if not in reality. The forgery was excellent, convincing enough to pass casual inspection, though prolonged scrutiny by someone familiar with authentic documents might reveal inconsistencies. Isaiah changed clothes in the shed, trading his work garments for the modest but respectable outfit of a tradesman traveling for business purposes. The transformation felt significant beyond simple costume change, as if by putting on different clothes he could shed the identity that had been imposed on him through decades of servitude. Joshua Freeman emerged from that shed, carrying a small pack and walking with the confident bearing of a man who had every right to move freely through public spaces. The psychological shift proved as important as physical disguise, projecting an attitude that deflected suspicion simply through the assumption of legitimacy. From the diary of Reverend Samuel Blackwood, August 13, 1852, a colored man came to evening service tonight, well-spoken and respectful, introduced himself as a Freeman carpenter heading north. He requested prayers for safe travel and donated $25 to the poor box. I saw nothing in his manner suggesting deception, though one learns to be cautious in these troubled times. The church service provided perfect cover, establishing presence in town at the precise time when Thornwood was dying alone in a mine shaft 12 miles away. Multiple witnesses would remember Joshua Freeman attending prayers, singing hymns with genuine feeling, listening attentively to the sermon about forgiveness and redemption. An alibi built not through deception, but through strategic use of truth, participating in community rituals that would seem inconsistent with a man fleeing murder charges. As darkness fell completely over Copper Ridge, Isaiah joined a freight wagon heading north toward Santa Fe, offering to help with driving in exchange for passage. The wagon master, a German immigrant named Klaus who operated independent of the major freight companies, accepted the arrangement without suspicion. Extra hands were always welcome on routes where Apache raids remained constant threat, and a carpenter's skills might prove useful if wagons needed repair during the journey. The freight wagon rolled out of Copper Ridge at midnight, carrying mining equipment, food supplies, and one passenger whose real destination lay far beyond Santa Fe. Isaiah sat beside Klaus on the driver's bench, watching stars wheel overhead in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia, indifferent to human concepts of justice or crime, or the complex moral calculations that separated liberation from murder. Behind them, Thornwood Ranch would be settling into evening routines, other enslaved workers completing final tasks before retreating to their quarters, unaware that their master lay dead in an abandoned mine shaft, sealed in a coffin that had been built with extraordinary care for precisely this purpose. Discovery would come tomorrow when Thornwood failed to appear for breakfast, when his absence stretched from unusual to alarming. But by then, Isaiah would be 50 miles away, moving steadily northward under a false name, protected by darkness and distance, and the careful planning that had made this escape possible. The manhunt would come eventually, bloodhounds and bounty hunters scouring territory for the fugitive Carpenter who'd murdered his master. Wanted posters would spread across New Mexico and beyond, offering rewards that would make every lawman and opportunist in the West search for a face that no longer existed. Because Isaiah had died in that workshop when he'd pressed chloroform-soaked cloth against Thornwood's face. Joshua Freeman had been born in those same moments, constructed from desperation and forged documents, given life through actions that could never be undone or forgiven by the society that had created the circumstances making them necessary. The freight wagon creaked and groaned as it climbed into higher elevations where air grew cooler and stars seemed close enough to touch. Klaus hummed German folk songs while driving, cheerful melodies that spoke of homelands left behind, and futures hoped for in new territories. Isaiah listened without joining in, his thoughts racing through the hours ahead, calculating distances and risks, measuring his slim chances of reaching free states before pursuit closed the gap. Back at Thornwood Ranch, Maria would be banking fires in the kitchen hearth, preparing for tomorrow's meals, wondering vaguely why the master hadn't appeared for his evening supper. By morning, that vague wondering would transform into active concern, then alarm, then the sickening realization that something terrible had occurred. Sarah would search the main house thoroughly, checking every room for signs of the missing master, finding nothing except empty spaces that suggested he'd simply vanished like smoke. The other workers would be questioned intensively, their genuine ignorance protecting them from accusations of conspiracy, while also preventing them from providing useful information about Thornwood's actual fate. And in the carpentry workshop, investigators would eventually notice details that suggested struggle, small signs that violence had occurred, despite Isaiah's attempts to clean evidence. The chloroform bottle half empty on a high shelf, rope fibers matching the type used in binding. Small bloodstains from where Thornwood had bitten his lip during the attack, drops that Isaiah had missed during his hasty cleanup. These clues would point toward Isaiah as suspect, but the carpenter's apparent absence would complicate investigation. Had he fled in panic after attacking his master? Or had Thornwood killed Isaiah and hidden the body before departing on mysterious business? Multiple theories would compete, each requiring different investigative approaches, creating confusion that served Isaiah's purposes even without intentional misdirection. The territorial sheriff would arrive within 48 hours, bringing deputies and tracking dogs that would pick up Isaiah's scent leading from the workshop to the wagon, then trace the route toward Copper Ridge. But there the trail would grow cold, complicated by dozens of other scents in the busy town, confused by the time gap between departure and investigation. By the time bloodhounds reached the livery stable where Isaiah had left Thornwood's wagon, Joshua Freeman would be 100 miles away, riding in a freight wagon that left no tracks investigators could follow, protected by the vastness of Western territory where a single man could disappear as completely as water absorbed by desert sand. Isaiah allowed himself one glance backward as the freight wagon crested a ridge that marked the final view of Copper Ridge's distant lights. Behind him lay everything he'd known for 8 years. The ranch that had been both workplace and prison. The master whose cruelty had pushed him beyond endurance into action that could never be forgiven or forgotten. Ahead lay only uncertainty, freedom conditional on avoiding capture, survival dependent on luck and careful planning in equal measure. But uncertainty beat servitude, and even death seemed preferable to returning to bondage after tasting the possibility of liberation. The stars wheeled overhead as the wagon rolled northward through darkness, carrying a man who'd been reborn through violence, traveling under a name that meant nothing except the desperate hope that identity could be chosen rather than imposed, that futures could be built from ashes of burned pasts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new calculations about survival in hostile territory. But tonight, for the first time in 28 years, Isaiah was moving towards something he'd chosen, rather than enduring what others had decided for him. That alone made everything worthwhile, regardless of what consequences might follow from the corpse sealed in darkness 12 miles behind him, waiting in its coffin tomb for discovery that might never come. The alarm bells rang across Thornwood Ranch at dawn on August 14th, their urgent clanging carrying across 30,000 acres of scrubland where cattle grazed and workers were just beginning their daily routines. Maria had discovered the master's empty bed, sheets undisturbed, no sign that he'd slept there overnight. Her concern had grown into panic when a thorough search of the main house revealed no trace of Garrett Thornwood anywhere on the property. Sarah ran to the carpentry workshop, finding it locked from outside but empty when she forced the door open with help from Thomas. The space appeared orderly at first glance, tools hanging in their designated places, sawdust swept into neat piles, everything suggesting normal end to a workday. But closer inspection revealed troubling details that made her blood run cold. The coffin was gone, which made sense given Isaiah's stated intention to transport it to Copper Ridge. But rope fibers littered the floor near the workbench, and a faint chemical smell hung in the air despite open windows. Most disturbing was the small, dark stain on the floorboards that might have been oil or varnish, but carried the distinctive rust-brown color of dried blood. Isaiah's missing too, Thomas reported after checking the quarters where enslaved workers slept. His bunk hasn't been used and his few possessions are gone. Looks like he packed and left during the night. The pieces fell together with horrible clarity. The master disappears after morning inspection of the coffin. The carpenter vanishes the same day, taking the completed work with him. Evidence of struggle or violence in the workshop where both men were last seen together. The implication seemed obvious even as they appeared impossible. How could an enslaved carpenter overpower and kill a man like Thornwood? And if such an unthinkable act had occurred, where was the body? The coffin provided an answer too terrible to speak aloud, but the thought occurred simultaneously to everyone examining the evidence. From the official report of Sheriff William Tucker, August 15, 1852, responding to reports of missing rancher Garrett Thornwood and his enslaved carpenter Isaiah, evidence at the scene suggests possible violence. The carpenter's disappearance coinciding with his master's creates strong suspicion of foul play. A manhunt has been organized to locate both men. Sheriff Tucker arrived with 4 deputies, their horses kicking up dust clouds visible for miles across the flat desert terrain. The lawmen examined the workshop with professional thoroughness, noting every detail that might reveal what had transpired. The rope fibers matched rope from the ranch's own tack room. The chemical smell was identified as chloroform by the town doctor who accompanied the investigation team. This was planned, Tucker announced after completing his inspection. The carpenter didn't act on impulse or in self-defense. He prepared for this, gathered materials, waited for his opportunity. This is premeditated murder, unless evidence proves otherwise. The other enslaved workers were questioned individually and as a group, deputies searching for any hint of conspiracy or advanced knowledge. But their ignorance proved genuine, protected by Isaiah's deliberate choice to keep them uninformed. Maria insisted she'd noticed nothing unusual about Isaiah's behavior. Sarah confirmed that the carpenter had mentioned Thornwood inspecting the coffin but provided no details suggesting violence was planned. Tracking dogs arrived that afternoon, bloodhounds bred specifically for following human scent across difficult terrain. They picked up Isaiah's trail immediately, following it from the workshop to where the wagon had stood, then tracking the route toward Copper Ridge with enthusiasm that suggested a fresh and obvious path. The manhunt party followed the dogs eastward, moving at speed that ate up the 12 miles to town in under 3 hours. But in Copper Ridge, the trail complicated significantly. Multiple scents converged at the livery stable where Isaiah had left Thornwood's wagon. The carpenter's scent mixed with dozens of others in the busy town, creating a confusion that frustrated even the most experienced tracking dogs. He was here, the dog handler confirmed, watching his animals circle the stable in increasingly frustrated patterns. But the scent disperses in too many directions. He either had help covering his tracks or got very lucky with timing and traffic. Witnesses were interviewed throughout Copper Ridge, shopkeepers and saloon patrons, and anyone who might have noticed an enslaved carpenter moving through town the previous afternoon. But no one remembered seeing anyone matching Isaiah's description. Or if they had, The memory failed to register as significant among the dozens of black faces that passed through a frontier town daily. Then Reverend Blackwood mentioned the freeman Carpenter who'd attended evening service, a well-spoken man traveling north seeking work. The description matched Isaiah's general appearance, but the confident bearing and free papers seemed inconsistent with a fugitive fleeing murder charges. Could the papers be forged? Tucker asked, already knowing the answer. Forged freedom documents circulated throughout the territories, some crude and obvious, others sophisticated enough to fool even experienced lawmen during casual inspection. He seemed entirely legitimate, Blackwood insisted, troubled by the suggestion that he'd been deceived, donated money to the poor box, sang hymns with genuine feeling. Nothing in his manner suggested deception or flight. But the timing was too coincidental to ignore. A carpenter matching Isaiah's description appearing in town the same day his master vanished, carrying papers that transformed him from enslaved to free, departing on a freight wagon heading north before investigation could begin. The pieces fit together despite Blackwood's protests about the man's apparent sincerity. Tucker sent telegrams to sheriffs throughout New Mexico Territory and beyond, describing the fugitive and offering a reward of $500 for information leading to capture. The amount represented serious money, enough to make every lawman, bounty hunter, and opportunist in the West start searching for a face that might be anywhere by now. Professional slave catchers were contacted, men who specialized in tracking runaways across vast distances, using networks of informants and intimate knowledge of routes fugitives typically followed toward free states. These hunters worked with cold efficiency, motivated purely by profit rather than any moral consideration about slavery's justice or injustice. The freight companies were questioned about wagons departing Copper Ridge on the night of August 13th. 3 separate outfits had sent cargo north toward Santa Fe, each carrying multiple passengers and crew. Tracking down every individual who might have traveled on those wagons would take weeks, and the fugitive could transfer to different transportation at any point along the route. He's got at least a 36-hour head start, Tucker calculated grimly. Could be in Colorado Territory by now, or heading east toward Kansas, or doubled back south toward Mexico. Without knowing which freight wagon he joined or what name he's using, we're searching blind. The investigation expanded to include searches of the abandoned mining areas east of Copper Ridge, deputies checking old shafts and tunnels where a body might be hidden. But the territory contained hundreds of such locations, and systematic searching would require months of effort with no guarantee of discovery. At the mine shaft where Thornwood's coffin had been deposited, nothing visible from the surface suggested recent activity. The wooden framework remained undisturbed, dust patterns showing no fresh tracks, darkness concealing whatever lay at the bottom of a shaft that descended beyond reach of lamplight or rope. Deputies peered into the darkness, calling out and listening for echoes that might indicate depth or contents, but the shaft swallowed sound without response, keeping its secrets as effectively as Isaiah had planned when choosing this location for disposal. Could take years to properly search every abandoned mine in this territory, one deputy observed, stepping back from the edge with visible relief. And even if we find something, identifying remains after exposure to elements becomes nearly impossible. The investigation reached its first frustrating impasse within 48 hours of beginning. They knew who had committed the crime, understood the general method, could trace the fugitive's path to Copper Ridge and no further. But the vastness of Western Territory defeated systematic pursuit, offering too many escape routes and too few resources for covering them all simultaneously. Tucker returned to Thornwood Ranch with the grim news that unless the carpenter made mistakes or encountered bad luck, capture seemed unlikely. The territory was simply too large, too empty, too full of places where a single man could disappear completely. Keep the reward posted, he instructed his deputies. Circulate wanted posters throughout every town and mining camp in the territory. Someone will spot him eventually, especially if he's trying to work as a carpenter under whatever name he's using now. Skills like that are too valuable to hide completely. But privately, Tucker suspected the fugitive had planned too carefully to make obvious mistakes. The chloroform, the timing, the forged papers, the strategic use of a freight wagon, all suggested intelligence and preparation that went beyond desperate improvisation. This wasn't a man fleeing in panic, but executing a plan developed over months of patient calculation. At Thornwood Ranch, the remaining workers continued their routines under overseer supervision, but the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. Fear mixed with something that might have been hope. Whispered conversations wondering whether Isaiah had actually escaped, whether freedom was possible for someone bold enough to seize it regardless of cost. The empty workshop stood as silent testament to what had transpired, its tools waiting for a craftsman who would never return, its walls holding secrets that would never be fully revealed. And somewhere in the vast western territories, a man with a new name traveled toward uncertain future, carrying memories of violence that would haunt him forever, but also carrying the possibility of liberation worth any price. 3 weeks after Garrett Thornwood's disappearance, a prospector named Dutch Herman descended into the abandoned mine shaft east of Copper Ridge, driven by rumors of a silver vein the original miners had missed before the collapse. Herman carried rope, lamps, and the reckless optimism that characterized men who spent their lives chasing mineral wealth through dangerous underground spaces. The descent proved more difficult than anticipated, the shaft angling steeply through unstable rock that shifted under his weight. Herman's lamp illuminated walls scarred by pickaxe strikes and drill holes, evidence of the frantic excavation that had preceded the collapse, killing 3 men 5 years earlier. 50 feet down, the angle steepened further, requiring careful navigation to avoid falling into darkness that seemed to extend indefinitely. At approximately 65 feet deep, Herman's lamp revealed something that didn't belong in a mine shaft. A wooden coffin lay wedged between rock walls, its surface scratched and splintered from the fall, but still fundamentally intact. The quality of construction was immediately apparent, even to Herman's untrained eye, dovetailed joints and brass fittings suggesting expensive craftsmanship rather than rough mining camp work. Herman approached cautiously, uncertain what he'd discovered but sensing its significance. The coffin lid had cracked during impact, a split running lengthwise that revealed glimpses of purple fabric within. No sound emerged from inside. No movement suggested anything living remained within the sealed space. With trembling hands, Herman pried the damaged lid further open, lamp held high to illuminate the interior. What he saw sent him scrambling back up the shaft with speed that nearly caused the fall he'd carefully avoided during descent, leaving his equipment behind in his panic to reach the surface and report his discovery. Sheriff Tucker returned to the mine shaft that same afternoon, accompanied by deputies and the town doctor who would examine whatever Herman had found. A proper recovery operation was organized. Ropes and pulleys assembled to extract the coffin from its resting place, without causing further damage that might compromise evidence. The retrieval took 6 hours of careful work, men lowering themselves into darkness to secure ropes around the coffin, then slowly winching it upward through the narrow shaft. The damaged box emerged into afternoon sunlight, its exterior coating of dust unable to conceal the quality craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. Dr. Benjamin Ashford supervised opening the lid fully, revealing contents that confirmed everyone's worst suspicions, while also raising new questions about exactly what had transpired 3 weeks earlier. Garrett Thornwood's remains lay inside, still partially recognizable despite decomposition accelerated by August heat and limited air circulation. But the positioning of the body told a story that transcended simple murder. Thornwood's wrists showed deep rope burns from struggles against bindings that had been removed at some point. His mouth bore evidence of gagging, fabric impressions still visible on decomposed tissue. Most tellingly, fingernail scratches covered the coffin's interior surfaces, desperate clawing that had accomplished nothing except documenting the victim's final hours of terror. He was alive when sealed inside, Ashford concluded after thorough examination. The scratching patterns and tissue damage under fingernails indicate he remained conscious for some time, possibly hours. Death came from suffocation as oxygen depleted in the confined space. The revelation transformed the investigation's nature from missing person case to confirmed murder, with details so horrifying that even hardened lawmen struggled with the implications. This wasn't killing in passion or self-defense, but calculated torture, imprisonment designed to maximize suffering before inevitable death. Tucker examined the coffin itself with renewed attention, noting the small holes drilled through the base that would have provided minimal airflow, the modifications to the lid hinges that allowed locking from outside, the careful construction that ensured the seal would hold against any attempts at escape from within. Every detail demonstrated planning and forethought inconsistent with spontaneous violence. Isaiah built this specifically for this purpose, Tucker said, running his fingers along the interior scratches. Spent weeks constructing Thornwood's tomb, while the man paid him for the work. This level of calculation suggests months of planning, maybe years of waiting for the right opportunity. The wanted posters were updated with new information. Reward increased to $1,000. Descriptions emphasized not just Isaiah's appearance but his exceptional carpentry skills that might be impossible to hide while working under assumed identity. Every sheriff's office, territorial marshal, and bounty hunter from Texas to California received notification that the fugitive was wanted for murder involving extraordinary premeditation and cruelty. But the discovery of Thornwood's body, while answering questions about his fate, provided no new leads regarding Isaiah's current location. 3 weeks had elapsed since the murder, time enough for a fugitive to travel hundreds of miles in any direction, to establish himself under false identity in communities that asked few questions about newcomers seeking honest work. The investigation into how Isaiah had obtained forged freedom papers led to dead ends. Informants in the underground network that supplied such documents unwilling to betray sources, even under threat of prosecution. The carpenter who'd attended Reverend Blackwood's service had vanished as completely as the enslaved man who'd sealed his master in a coffin tomb. At Thornwood Ranch, news of the confirmed murder created complicated reactions among the remaining enslaved workers. Horror at the brutal method mixed with understanding of the desperation that had driven Isaiah to such extremes. None would speak openly in support of what he'd done, but neither would they condemn a man who'd struck back against the system that oppressed them all. The ranch itself fell into legal limbo, Thornwood's estate contested by distant relatives who appeared suddenly to claim inheritance rights. The enslaved workers existed in uncertain status, their ownership disputed between multiple parties, their futures dependent on legal proceedings that might take years to resolve. Maria continued preparing meals in the kitchen where Isaiah had worked, sometimes pausing to look toward the empty carpentry shop and wonder where he was now, whether he'd found the freedom he'd killed to obtain. Sarah cleaned rooms that no master occupied, the main house feeling haunted not by Thornwood's ghost, but by the absence of the man who dared to challenge the natural order everyone else accepted as inevitable. The coffin itself was held as evidence, stored in the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Office where curious townspeople came to view the instrument of Thornwood's death. They marveled at the craftsmanship, the precision joinery, the careful modifications that had transformed furniture into torture device. Some saw only horror in the scratched interior surfaces. Others recognized the skill required to build something that served its dark purpose so effectively. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.